right. Well, I want to go ahead and welcome you. I'm going to start sharing my screen at this point, and we're looking at Romans chapter 1. And we've come to a point here in the text where there's a transition taking place in verse 8. I'll go ahead and read that text in Greek and then do some translation and discussion of it, and we'll see how far we get. I hope we get to at least verse 14, but that'd be kind of moving a little bit fast. We actually may not make it that far, but I'm prepared to go through there, maybe even 17, but we'll see. We'll see. So, just a quick summary. One thing I think that has become pretty clear to me is that Paul really is going to be expositing the gospel, okay, the gospel of God. This gospel is about his son, and there's been quite an elaboration of his son, who is Jesus, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, and is our Lord. Okay. So he is going to um, continue to exposit about the gospel of his son. We're going to see that actually right here, the gospel of his son. So let's go ahead and read verse 8. Proton men evkaristo to theomu dia Jesu Christu peri panton umon oti e pistis umon kat angelitetai te en olo to cosmo. So kat angel lite in oloto cosmo. So first, indeed, I give thanks. I'm giving thanks to my God through Jesus Christ concerning you all. So I'm just going to do a little bit of light marking. So here we have some prepositional phrases through Jesus Christ concerning all of you, concerning you all. Okay. So the main verb is I give thanks. It takes the dative case. Well, um, this is really indicating the person to whom the thanks is giving. So I'll call that the indirect object. I give thanks to the person of God, of my God. So I give thanks to God. And so this leaves us at the beginning to consider men and then proton. So proton is an adverb. It's a part of speech. It's from protos, first or foremost, but adjectives can be formed into adverbs. They can take the morpheme ending like os, omega, sigma, or sometimes they can be put into the neuter accusative or neuter plural and be made into like have an adverbial sense. And that's what we see here. Firstly, indeed. Now, men is kind of interesting because typically we think of men working with a de, men-de construction. But this men doesn't seem to be working with one unless we take it with the de down in verse 12. But when we come to this, we'll see that this tuto is really grounding it to verse 11, and so I don't think the de is is going that far back. So men. So this is men solitarium and working alone. And what men does is it points forward. It anticipates something. So this comes out of the work of Christopher Fresh in my In Step with God's Word, which I actually don't have open. I do have my Koine Greek grammar open. I'm looking up. I'm looking up at my monitor. Let me see if I can quickly look up the pragmatic constraints of men, but I'm summarizing the work of Christopher Fresh. It is continuative but forward pointing. So it definitely is forward pointing. Fresh, it says, quoting him, it men alerts readers to forthcoming necessary corresponding and semantically related material that needs to be processed together with the host utterance in which men occurs, and instructs readers to build their mental representation of the discourse by regarding the resultant grouping as a coherent discourse unit that provides relevant information about the preceding or presupposed topic. So, so yeah, it's basically saying what I'm saying here is glued together, I think, with what comes next. Although he does say it's about a preceding relevant information. So I would say that that's going to be um, building on the fact that this is the gospel that he's going to be expositing. So I think it's continuative, but then also forward pointing. So it's a serving as a connector. Now, with those kind of pragmatic constraints. So I give thanks to my God through Jesus Christ concerning all of you, because so OT is marking content but supporting what has just been said. So why am I giving thanks? Your faith or your faithfulness is being announced in the whole world. All right. So your faith or faithfulness. Now, the word pistis, we need to remember that it's not just faith, but really entails like trust, which entails faithfulness. So to have faith means to place your trust and to be faithful to something. So your faith, your trust here is going to have an object. It's going to have an object and also a content, but there's also a subjective element to that, that they are invested in having faith, and so here their faith has an object, and presumably the object of that faith is their trust and allegiance to the gospel of God's Son, Jesus. So yeah, so Tom is wanting me to summarize men again. According to Fresh, it alerts, and this comes out of his dissertation work, it alerts readers to forthcoming necessary corresponding related material. So it's forward pointing in that regard. Um, and instructs readers to build their mental representation of the discourse by regarding the grouping as a coherent discourse that continues, I think, a preceding or presupposed topic. So basically, there's a continuative dimension of it, but then it's also pointing forward and pointing forward in a way that says there's a group of content that needs to be held together. Now, I think that that particularly is understood when we have a men-det construction. So men-det typically might be translated not only this, but also this. And so the men in that case with the working with the de is clearly saying, keep this in mind as I add the de material to the representation. So I think that's what the men is doing here, even though there's not a corresponding de. It's so it's marking not a hard break with what's gone before, but it's saying, oh, there's a new section here of content that needs to be kept in mind.
So you would say, Dr. Long, in a way, it's sort of like, having said this, let me continue to expound that in this way. Is that
Yes.
how I'm
And
understanding
and
you?
and and what follows, which is a yes, exactly. I think that's a good way of putting it. If there were a corresponding de, we would want to bunch that together with it, that kind of works together, but we don't have that de um, that I can tell. I don't think these down here work with that. Although maybe this de here does. And it's not, this is certainly related because he wants to come visit them. He wants to come visit them. Their faithfulness is known throughout the whole world. So yeah, I think that's the best thing that I can explain at this point. I don't have the Baylor Handbook of Romans, I don't believe, with me. Yeah, so I wonder how they
Take
might explain it there.
Thank you for taking
Okay.
an extra beat to go into that.
No, 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 that's fine. Yeah, these connectors are really important because they provide semantic constraints, but it's also new research. So it's and you talk to some people, I talk to my colleagues and I probably most New Testament people and they're not aware of this new discussion. They're just not aware of it. So, and yet it is out there, but it's just not well known. And the implications of it are still, I think are still being worked out. For me, I'm working on a grammar. I would consider it an advanced grammar. And one of the areas I'm really going to look at is, well, I think it's going to be about information structure. I think that might even be in the title. But one really important place to look to understand the priority and relation of information is to look at these connectors. Yeah. Okay. So the OT is starting a subordinate clause, and this subordinate clause is providing the support for why Paul is giving thanks. Now it's kind of notable that you have these gray highlights are quantitative specifiers, and what this does is these are nuances. They're unnecessary, but they add some oomph, some if they have an effect to really fill out. It's not just concerning you, it's all of you, you know. And in the context of Romans, right, there's some disputes that he's going to get to in chapter 14 and 15. There's not the most unity, right? So Paul is affirming them all. He's affirming them all. The Jewish groups, the Jewish Christian groups, the Gentile Christian groups. Of course, that's a big question for Romans is the audience primarily to be understood as non-Judean, or is it a mix? And how do we understand that mix of Jews, Judeans, and non-Jews? But the you all captures them all, and it seems very fitting. And the whole world, I mean, that's significant to me. He doesn't use the word inhabited world, oikumene. He doesn't use that word. He uses cosmos, which is, I think, larger, larger in scope. So the inhabited world, oikumene, I'm mispronouncing that. It's oikumene. Oikumene refers particularly to the Roman inhabited world, whereas cosmos is broader. It's broader than that. So, but he says the whole world. So the scope is complete. It's a complete scope. Um, and so that's, I think, for effect. Okay, now verse 9, Martus garmu estin o theos. O latrevo ento pneumatimu ento evangelio tu iu avtu. Os adie liptos minian umon piume. All right. For God is my witness. For God is my witness. Okay. So gar is a connector. I put a box around it. That's a bad box. For God is my witness. This is a predicate nominative. God is the subject. It has the article. Um, One rule here is kind of interesting that this is it Caldwell's rule? I think it's Caldwell's rule, where the predicate nominative, when it precedes the verb of being, which is emi, this is from emi, is often anarthrous, even though it's still definite. So anarthrous means it has no article. So this comes into play when interpreting verses like found in John 1. Um, the word was God, not a God. The word became flesh, not a flesh. Um, so this, God is my witness, not, a witness of mine, but my witness. Like he is, it's a definite kind of witness, a witness belonging to Paul, or about Paul. So at this point, I think we're moving into testimony. All right, this is testimonial language. Now, in rhetoric, when you start dropping witnesses and testimony, you're moving into a type of mode which is narration, narratio. Um, and so I think that move is going to be even more certain when we get to verse 13. I don't want you to be ignorant. And so I think that here we are still probably in the proem, the material that is establishing the basic framework for the speech, a speech that is given. The proem kind of provides a basic orientation and establishes goodwill. And so I think we have both an establishment of goodwill, but also some indication that we do have narrative material, and particularly a formula for narratives is I don't want you to be ignorant about something in the past. And so it's going to be a very short narrative, like one verse, because when we get to verse 14, we're going to see that verse 14 has no connector. You have a syndeton. When you have a syndeton, that means a break. Unless you have some parallel material in a rhetorical flourish, which maybe we might argue we do to the Greek and to the barbarian, to the wise and to the foolish, I am an obligator. Possibly, but I do think there is a break going on right here. I think this is where the thesis statement begins, but I anticipate that discussion. We'll see if we get that far. But all to say is that this idea of calling upon God as a witness, this is something that would happen in narrations, um, that you would call upon witnesses to bear fact to the testimony of the case. Although here, the testimony of God is about present realities of Paul praying always for the Romans. And this, I think, establishes very goodwill, which is a function of the section of a speech typically before the narration material. So speeches, depending on the type of speech, were laid out a proemium, introductory material establishing goodwill, narration if it was needed. It not always is needed, but to establish like a the basic facts pertaining to what's going to be argued. And then after the narration, you would have a thesis statement or a partition if there's multiple thesis statements. Now, this is, I think, going to be important to see because I mean, if we can find that Paul is outlining what he's going to be talking about from a discourse perspective, that's very significant, right? Because if an author, if we can discern an author is making generalized statements or summarizing statements, that will guide our understanding of the text. And certainly in Romans, he does that multiple times, which is interesting because we may not think, classically there was only one thesis statement or one partition, but it's interesting in Roman rhetoric that we can read about in the person of Quintilius. So Quintilius was a Roman theoretician, rhetorician under Domitian. So he's writing his masterwork on rhetoric in the first century, end of the first century. He says you use partitions, thesis statements wherever you need them, anywhere in the speech. And lo and behold, in Romans, I've identified at least three of them, if not even more. So these little summary statements are significant to find. Okay, so God is Paul's witness, and uh, to whom. Now, this is a dative relative pronoun, which starts a relative clause. That's why I put a bracket there, and is the direct object. I should probably put a double underline here because this verb latrevo takes the dative case for its um, direct object, whom I serve. Yeah, so I find this kind of interesting. Uh, that Paul is using this verb here. This is an unusual word for worship. I think it deserves closer examination. So when you're reading a Greek text, if you start seeing unusual words beyond the ones that you've learned, beginning Greek 1 and 2, and maybe intermediate Greek, if you start seeing some interesting word choices, you should pay attention for and ask why. So I think we're going to see. Uh, I think this construes more of a cultic sense, but I don't want to take the time in BDAG to look at that in LSJ, but we could. And what I find particularly interesting is that this serving is in my spirit, whom I serve in my spirit in the gospel of his son. So there we have that prepositional phrase again, the gospel about his son. So this may be a genitive of content, right? The gospel. Maybe we could say it's an appositional genitive, the gospel, namely, which concerns specifically his son. So it's, the kind of genitive that we have here. I mean, obviously the his is relationship. This refers to God. But the gospel of his son, I mean, what is the relationship of son to that gospel? Is it the content of it? Is it appositional in the sense that it's providing more specific identification of the gospel? I'm curious why Paul talks about serving God in his spirit. Like, I don't even know what that means. Like, why this is extra information. Like, we don't need to, he doesn't need to specify that, I don't think, right? So this is an adjunct. In terms of grammar, you have main sentence components, subject, verb, objects. Everything else is a modifier and is not needed. So when you're adding these extra things, I'm always wondering about motivation. What motivates that? What is that really adding to the discourse, to the mental representation of Paul? Like, why do we need to know about Paul's spirit? Now, I mean, I wonder if possibly I mean, I don't know if it's relating back to forward to like Paul's distress that he's got this grief in his heart, in my spirit, in the Holy Spirit, his conscience, and he's got this grief, great grief in his heart. So I don't know. It's interesting that later, Paul is going to be talking about his interior disposition. And at chapter 9, he's distressed at the unbelieving state of many of his kinsfolk according to the flesh. And this is a big theodicy issue. Um, so, yeah, I don't know. I'm just curious about this appeal to Paul's interior spirit.
Dr. Long, I feel like it might also look forward to Romans 7 and 8, where Paul is talking about the things that he accomplishes in his spirit and then what God has accomplished in his flesh and what God has accomplished in his spirit, in
Hmm.
our spirits in Romans 8. And so, like, maybe there's a sort of thematic setup that's happening in Romans 1.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. I'd want to explore that for sure. Yeah, I set my mind on the things of the spirit. I don't know, that's capital S. I don't know if I do think he does probably refer to spirit, and he makes distinctions of flesh and spirit. Um, but I don't know if he's talking about his internal spirit, it may, but he does talk about his mind and the spirit, his inner person, his body. There's something going on in his body that's waging war with his mind and maybe his spirit. This gets us to wonder, who is this person that is referred to in chapter 7? That's is this Paul present? Is it Paul past? Is it Adam? Some people, my colleague has argued it's Adam. I think it's maybe someone who is trying to live according to the law without the power of the Spirit that can't do it. And the reason why is because there is a partition right there. These two verses, 7, 5, and 6, outline rest of chapter 7 and then chapter 8. And so to understand this as a partition, this is one of those partitions I was talking about. To see this from a discourse perspective is really key to interpret the discourse. So I think chapter verse 5 here uh, is described in full in the rest of chapter 7, and then verse 6 is describing what happens in chapter 8. So if that obtains, if I'm correct about that, that has implications for how to interpret that. But but yeah, I do think there is something anticipatory about the discussion that Paul is going to be having. And part of that discussion is these passions, is the flesh, is sin that tempts and works and wages war, and the need for me to, in my inner self, to direct my mind towards the things of the spirit. And this is our way out of that. This is the way out of the flesh. It's having mastery over our sinful fleshly desires, which wage war against us. We're literally in a war about that. And yeah, so I think that's very helpful. Thank you. I think you're right about that. Okay, so coming back to one note, he's serving God in his spirit in the gospel of his son. So God is testimony about something. So this is a first subordinate clause, which I'm going to label 1. I'm closing it off. A second subordinate clause is beginning with this os. How? Now, os is marked for manner. That's it. That's part of its semantic marking is manner. And this is actually the content of what God is testimony to. How unceasingly I make remembrance of you. And that's probably an objective genitive. So I am making remembrance. This is from pieo. Pieo, I make or I do. This is a great example of a middle. This is a middle voice. So I am making remembrance for you. unceasingly, unceasingly. This word is great to pull apart. Lepto, it's got an alpha privative, dia, and then lipo, to leave. So not leaving aside completely. So this is a really strong adverb of describing the manner of Paul's unceasingness and making remembrance. And this idea of manner is also, as I mentioned before, construed in the use of os. So Paul didn't just use ot, right? He could have used ot as a content of, God is my witness. He could have used ot, but he doesn't. Instead, he uses os, which construes manner. And then we have a manner adverb here. And yeah, so this is a strong testimony that God gives about Paul in regard to his making remembrance. Now, verse 10 continues this, it ramps it up even with the pantote. Pantote is an adverb of quantity and time, always, in every time, always, in my prayers. Um, and then there is another subordinate clause, requesting or supplicating if, and then another subordinate clause. At this point, we're getting layers of subordinate clauses. I'm going to have to just end all these here because this is where they end. It gets kind of confusing to figure out what ends where. I think the outer one is the os clause, and then we have the e clause. No, we have the participle clause. And then we have the E clause. And it's possible that we might even have another infinitive clause. We have to look at that. Is that a clause or is that like a complementary infinitive? That's just open question mark. Okay, so we got to back out a little bit. So the main sentence is, God is my testimony, how I unceasingly make remembrance of you always in my prayers. So I wish that verse 10 should probably have been put to there because the first part of verse 10 really is going pretty instrumentally with making requesting. So requesting is a participle that is um, post nuclear, post position. It's a circumstantial participle. In my understanding of participles, circumstantial participles, there's an information structure conveyed. This one is located after its nuclear verb, which is piume, which, and I would say it's an explanatory participle. So it's explaining more about the nature of the remembrance and his prayers, and it's kind of zeroing in on one aspect of that, or maybe a major aspect is something that Paul's saying that he's requesting. And the request of that uses an if clause, if. And then look at all these adverbs piled up. If somehow, still, or already, at some time, I would be able to come to you in the will of God. Wow. Okay. So that's what he's been praying for. He has been wanting constantly, unceasingly in his prayer. He's been requesting if somehow, still, or already at some point, he would be able to. Here's a future passive construction. It's from ev, which means this is an adverbial prefix meaning good or well. Odo, this is from odos, meaning like travel, like have a good travel opportunity. Perhaps that'd be the way to translate that. To come. So this is indeed like I would say probably a complementary infinitive, travel opportunity to come, or we could take it as indeed a subordinate clause, with us. I think it is a verb of motion with an infinitive. I think I might describe that as a infinitive of purpose. Now it's not a strong purpose clause. Those of you may know, like I've presented papers on purpose clauses, and I've identified like 12 different constructions that convey purpose with different semantic marking. And a verb of motion with an infinitive indeed marks a kind of purpose. It's not the minimum type of purpose, but it's certainly not the maximum marking for purpose. But with this verb of this is a not a this is an unusual verb of motion. It's to travel well, have a good opportunity to travel, to come to you. It is there's a little bit of prominence because this verb is so unusual. Um, and I do, so Paul basically has been wanting to come visit them, and he qualifies it in the will of God. Now this this is pretty funny. I have to laugh at this because um, with the Corinthians, look, if you look at the end of First Corinthians, he adds this qualification, if it is God's will, to come visit them in a certain kind of way. And my whole dissertation topic, and it's now published in Cambridge, was looking at the rhetorical circumstance of First and Second Corinthians, particularly Second Corinthians. And basically, Paul gets in trouble with them because he didn't come when he said he would, or in the way that he said he would, even though he qualified it at the end of First Corinthians, if it's God's will. I mean, it's quite fascinating. Quite fascinating. If you look at the narrative material of Second Corinthians, and so see now we're getting into rhetoric. Um, Here's the beginning of the narrative material there. This is what we see in Romans. We're going to see it in just a moment. I don't want you to be ignorant, and the focus of this is Paul's intentions to come visit them. Look at the verbs for coming, to come visit you first. I was intending this, I was intending you that. And so Paul has to really defend his intentions. And he's being accused of acting in a worldly or fleshly manner. So that's a whole other discussion. If you want to read my dissertation on that, I go into that. I don't think I have a copy of it here, but I just have to laugh at the appeal to the will of God, um, because by this point it's a pretty serious consideration. Like, is God going to open up for me to come? Because circumstances are kind of crazy. I mean, his travel itinerary has been switched around. So anyway, I think that's a really interesting qualification that has a bit of a history when I look at Paul's previous writings. Okay, so this is a complex sentence with at least five, I think five subordinate clauses if I've counted them all, maybe six. And this is why I like the constituent marking method is you can pull this apart and start to mark it. I think maybe the semantic diagramming might have been even better able to show this, but I'm not going to pull the text apart to do that. Are there any questions? Let me just stop here. Any questions about verse 9 and 10 and what's being accomplished there?
I think it strikes me based on what you just said of how important face-to-face communication was in terms of if you cared, you'd come kind of a thing.
Yes,
Really
yeah, he was
cared,
in
you would
trouble.
be here. And he's
Yes,
just falling over himself, feeling, I think, that need to underscore again and again, look, I really want to be there.
yeah,
Because I guess he feels that cultural need of if you really cared about us, why haven't we seen you?
yeah,
Which is
yeah,
funny considering how difficult getting around, how dangerous it was to get around at that time. And we don't
Yeah.
really, now it's easy for us to get around. I don't think we feel that quite as much today. But then it seemed like they really did. Like if you really care, you would bodily make the journey and come here and see us.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. That's a good point. I mean travel was dangerous, but it was also very possible. Like it's not an excuse. Paul did not like ships. He was shipwrecked a lot. And that's partly why he went on foot. It explains his itinerary of traveling through Macedonia. That's partly, why, but but yeah, people were traveling a lot though. So, I mean, on the one hand, I mean, I think you make a fair point. But on the other hand, there's also the availability of traveling. There was a stability. The Romans had made all these roadways. They were marked, mile markers and that kind of thing. So, so yeah, I mean, I think we do see Paul really wanting to express the strong desire to be there. And I think this is a way of him expressing honor to them. You are after all, all roads lead to Rome was a saying, that was the center of the inhabited world, oikumene. Um, but the cosmos was even bigger than that. But Paul wanted to really convey that he wanted to be there and for this not to be understood as a slight to them. Yeah.
Is he
Um,
maybe also as a rhetorician dealing with possible things that he could hear people kind of
yes.
coming up in their minds, like I need to deal with that as I get into
Yes.
my argument.
Absolutely. We're going to see that um, in I think it's 3, 8, and 9, mysteriously, Paul says, as people slanderously say that we say. It kind of comes out of nowhere. So indeed, one of the purposes of Romans is to clear the air of misconstruals of Paul, certainly. And one of those misconstruals, and it's a very serious one, is that Paul promotes immorality because he does not advocate law observance. That's a huge one. Huge, right? Because if you don't follow the law, if you're not a strict adherent of following the law and bringing people under the law, I mean, what's the basis for your morality? So this is something that he struggles with his entire ministry, as we can see in his letters. I mean, I'm teaching through the pastorals, and I'm just amazed at the I think they're authentically Pauline, that the issue there are these teachers that are somehow aligning themselves with the law in a way that is confusing people. It shows up again and again. So Philippians, it shows up again. There's something about the circumcision group. I think that he needs to clear that air for sure. Yeah, he needs to clear that air that his gospel is not immoral. He actually advocates for the obedience of faith among the nations. And he's gonna make some really interesting arguments in chapters 1 and 2 and 3 that we'll get to eventually, Lord willing, that I think will kind of shock you a little bit. And there'll be readings of those verses that I'll put forward that are going to support that his gospel is a gospel of justice and right living. It condemns sin and it promotes good deeds and good works. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I think this is all very interesting. There's honor shame dynamics here. I mean, he's going to flat out admit that, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I mean, that's a big cultural statement here. And this gospel is power. It is power for salvation. Salvation is not just future stuff. It's present sanctification. So if you read Romans 6, I mean that Romans 6 and 8, the grace the abundant grace that's been given doesn't mean that we continue sinning. No, no, no. Instead, that grace enables and makes us slaves of obedience and slaves of righteousness. And righteousness, we'll get to this in more detail. And I think I can show you this is right relating. And right relating means living rightly. And God rightly relating to us means condemning our sin and saving us from it. And that's the prerogative of our creator God, that he restores us. He's in the process of restoring us, not just forgiving us, as important as that is and foundational. Absolutely, we need the forgiveness, but there's an aspect of this freedom, this enablement of grace that is Paul is going to lean into. And this is a corrective of misunderstandings of him. Yeah. So there is definitely a corrective understanding of him. And as we'll see in the next verse, he wants to have like a mutual exchange with them. Yeah, a mutual exchange. And what is the nature of that exchange? I mean, that's a little bit of an interesting question, but let's go on here. Verse 11, epipothogar idin umas. Uh, for I am desirous to see you. For I desire to see you. Now, this verb desire is a strong word. Indeed, if you look up BDAG, I think it's going to say like a strong word of desire. So that was my sense when I came to it. I'm like, okay, this is not just any kind of desire. It is a strong one. Yeah, to have a strong desire for something. So strong word, a strong desire. I have a strong desire to see you in order that ina ti metado charisma umin pneumatikon isto stericthene umas. Okay. So I have the strong desire to see you, and then we come across a purpose clause in order that I might give some, and this is a really fascinating construction because T is an indefinite pronoun, meaning some. It can also function as like an adjective. So some charisma, mean indirect object, panavmatikon, panavmatikon, spiritual. Wow. So this, when you basically having what's called discontinuous constituents, they're separated from each other. Typically, Greek is presented in chunks, and typically nouns and their modifiers are going to be together. But when you start separating them all, there's some effect achieved. And Stephen Levinson talks about this. He says it kind of depends. Sometimes it's the fronted element, sometimes it's the later element. But here, this is like the most extreme example of discontinuous because you have three parts to this modification that are separated from one another. You have the some spiritual, those are both adjectival, and then you have the main noun, which is gift. So some spiritual gift to you. Um, yeah, I don't know why he does that. Um, I don't know what's achieved by doing that. I don't know. Usually, grammar, when I see weird syntax like this, sometimes there's a motivation that is obvious. The only thing that I'm thinking about is, I mean, there's obviously a complexity to this, right? So, like someone hearing this would have to engage their mind a bit more because the elements that belong together are actually separated. There's words intervening. So it takes more cognitive processing. It's like a harder thing to understand. So in that regard, it's there's more attention drawn to it. So I think probably that is true. There's more attention drawn to this some spiritual thing. Like what is it? And we actually don't know what it is. What is this? what is this spiritual grace, this gift? What is it? There's that word spirit again, right? So Paul serves God in his spirit. There's also some prominence to this because it's leading to a purpose clause. Isto streixthene is a purpose construction, and it's a rather more marked purpose construction than the inna clause. So inna is I think it's the default purpose construction, inna with the subjunctive. Isto with the infinitive is more archaic, it's archaic, it's rarer, and I think it's more prominent. Uh, so this is like the ultimate goal is to be strengthened, that he could strengthen, that they would be strengthened. So the means to that strengthening is some spiritual gift. Okay, and this is what Paul wants to impart. So at this point, if we're looking at this from a sociological perspective and honor shame and from ancient culture, Paul wants to adopt a patron client relationship of some sort. He wants to come and offer a gift to them, okay, which is a nice thing to do. Um, and and I think he needs to be careful here though, because he was not the founding apostle, and yet he also has something to give. Like he knows he has something to give to them. So what is that? What is that he's giving? I mean, I think that's the question. I was reading Longenecker's commentary recently, and he basically says it's the content of the gospel, that that's what he wants to give. And that may be true. His insight into the nature of the gospel of his son, which we've been seeing as kind of a theme of these opening verses, the gospel of his son. Perhaps this might explain, the fact that Paul is kind of wanting to give something as like a patron, making the Roman Christians his client. He quickly adjusts that in verse 12, which is maybe quite intentional to underscore the mutuality of this exchange. So let's look at verse 12, and that's probably all we're going to have time for. Tuto de estin sum parakleithene en umin dietes en allelus pisteus umon ted ke imu. All right, this is beautiful. So de is adding a new or a distinctive point, and uh, and tuto estin is like that is. It's like a that this is moreover, this is something like that is how I would translate it. I would say this might be a quick addition, and that quick addition is construing togetherness and one anotherness and a mutuality of teke, your faith and my faith. Okay. So let's unpack that a little bit. Moreover, that is to be mutually encouraged. That's what sum paraklethe means. This is infinitive. Um, so the resultant of this gift giving and strengthening is a mutual encouragement among you, in you, through dia, through, that is the means by which, through the faith of yours and mine in among one another. Now, this is a big sandwich. It's kind of a difficult thing to unpack. So what's happening is the dia is governing. Let me highlight some things to see if I can unpack that. The dia is governing faith through the faith among one another. Okay, well, I don't even know what that means exactly. Through the faith among one another. So allelon is a mutual pronoun, it's a reciprocal pronoun. So our trust through through our faith in Jesus, our faithfulness in the gospel among one another. So somehow, and this faith, by the way, is what's stressed here is this faith is both yours and mine. So this teke is a nice Greek coordinated construction. The te is working with the ke, the teke. So the te is a post positive. So it's linking yours and mine together. And this is a real nice construction to kind of put these genitive possessive pronouns together in a tighter kind of way. It's not just your and my faith, it's both yours and my faith in one another. So, I mean, what is he saying here? I mean, it's he's stressing that there's a mutuality that is gonna result, a mutual encouragement which arises from a mutual faith, yours, both yours and mine, and it's in the context of one another. So I find this really intriguing that Paul, right after he could be understood as adopting this superior or a patron, like a higher status kind of role, that he very quickly qualifies that by adding new information with the de, which is stressing togetherness. And this togetherness is stressed by the sum. This is the preposition soon added on to the verb parakleo, to encourage, exhort. It's also seen in the reciprocal pronoun, and then it's seen by this what I call correlative emphasis by using the te construction to show the mutuality of the faith. Yeah. So yeah, we didn't quite make it to the start of the thesis. We will next time. But yeah, that's what I see going on. Paul is really establishing goodwill. He's been praying for them. He's been wanting to, in God's will, to come to them. And he wants to have this mutual exchange. And he wants to give them a spiritual gift, some spiritual gift. We don't know what that is, but it's meant to be for mutual encouragement in each other's faith. I just think that in my own, just a quick closing thought here, I think the fellowship that believers can share in each other's presence is very powerful. When Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he talked about when they got together, ideally, there should be prophesying going on, and someone from the outside could look in and hear and say, God is truly among you. So I just think that I think there was a powerful expectation of being together corporately and having fellowship in a very intentional way. And I think God was expected to to show up in tangible ways. And part of this tangibleness, well, it's always for mutual encouragement. What form would it take? Might be in a prophetic word, a word that is encouraging. Um, yeah. So he wants to be in their presence and to be mutually encouraged. And he's expectant that when he comes, that he actually is going to share something spiritual, some spiritual gift with them that would build them up. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining in, and look forward to seeing you next week. And thanks for everybody. Have a good week.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Long.
Take care, everybody.
Have a good
Bye.
one.
You too.